tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So we've been talking, we came out of a bunch of weeks talking about the Anapanasati Sutta, and the end of that discourse, the end of the long instructions on mindfulness of breathing, arrives at the investigation and insight into impermanence, anicca, and really with the inquiry process of how that insight or the reflection on impermanence unfolds through the seeing of the fading away of phenomena, the cessation of phenomena, and the letting go of phenomena. And so we came through that a couple weeks ago, and last week I talked a bit about how that insight of impermanence is interwoven with the other two of the characteristics. So the list of the three characteristics or marks of phenomena, the T lakhana, T is three, lakhana is marks or characteristics. The T lakhana is a list of these three qualities that are in many ways a shorthand for what is seen or understood when insight is attained. And so they're both aspects of our experience to contemplate in an active way, to investigate in an active way, and they are realizations that come in the course of practice. So the tilakkhana, or the three characteristics, are anicca, dukkha, and anatta. Anicca, impermanence; dukkha, unsatisfactoriness or painfulness; and anatta, not self or selflessness. And a question came between last week and this week around the quality of selflessness, anatta, and around how to practice that quality in daily life. So in a way, how to bring the inquiry into that quality into our ongoing practice. So I want to speak about that a bit tonight, and in a way just expand on this, strangest of insights of the three, as it were. The basics of anatta are familiar to many of you, I know, because I know many of you, and when we circle back to the concepts, particularly of impermanence and suffering, over and over, right? They're the basis of the inquiry that the Buddha pointed toward. When the Buddha gave his first teaching, laying out the middle path and the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, he doesn't say a word about impermanence, but the insight that his friend Kondanya has is that everything that is subject to arising is subject to passing away. And so the reflection on the Noble Truths, this is dukkha, this is the cause of dukkha, craving, this is the cessation of dukkha through the cessation of craving, that explanation led Kondanya to the understanding of impermanence, or the insight into impermanence. So everything we experience is born of conditions, and we ourselves are born of conditions, based in conditions changing. Experience changes, lives change, bodies change, birth and death happens. Pleasure and pain come and go. All of the worldly winds blow around all the time. And you can feel the way that the insights or the marks of impermanence and suffering, or dukkha, are so interwoven, right? The definition of dukkha is completely interwoven with impermanence. Getting something you didn't want, not getting something you did want, birth being painful, aging being painful, death being painful, loss of those you love and things you love being painful. And the experience of grasping itself at anything, and in the definition of suffering, it's that this is framed as the grasping aggregates, or the 5 aggregates subject to grasping. So forms, feelings, perceptions, formations, consciousness itself, all of these can be grasped at. When there's grasping at something that is by its nature impermanent, there's going to be dukkha, or difficulty with that. The pleasant things we want to sustain cannot be sustained. The painful things we want to prevent, many cannot be prevented because they arise based in conditions, and there are more conditions at play than our preferences. Although the toddlers don't know that yet, but they will. And so anicca and dukkha, they often feel like, oh, I get an intuitive hit of that. That makes sense. Cognitively, and even with a little bit of practice, you can start to get a felt sense of like, oh yeah, you know, I loved this person and now they're gone. I loved this house and now I have to move out of it. I loved my country, but it's changing. I love my body, but it's changing. Like all of these things that are examples of loss are not mystical. They are palpable. They are all around us all the time. They can be felt. And you can feel dukkha. That's the thing about dukkha, right? Like it is the painful. You can feel it. And it's not difficult to understand that the emotional distress that accompanies life is so much about these, our reaction to the fluctuations of things, getting what I want, not getting what I want, getting what I didn't want, etc. Loss. But then what about this third characteristic of anatta, not self? The standard explanation of anatta is that the an is the negative, atta is the Pali version of a word that you might be also familiar with in its Sanskrit version of Atman. And atta or Atman refers to a stable, permanent, essential nature in a thing. It's like the fundamental essence of a thing. And that's true if it's, an object or a living body or a concept. So to think that, this tea mug, which is my tea mug, and I love it, it's my favorite mug, to think that it is, first of all, to think that it's a mug is challenges anatta, because it's actually just momentarily a mug in between a very long life as a patch of mud. It started as mud, right now it's a mug, eventually it'll be mud again. And for this little window of time in the middle, it looks like a very artful tea mug. So there's its identity as a mug that with some reflection I can understand is born out of conditions, not permanent. It doesn't have the soul of a mug because there's no soul in mugs. They start as clay, they become something else. But also it has this identity as being mine. It was a gift from my friends. In a mysterious turn of circumstances, my friends aren't quite as much my friends anymore, which is a loss. So it started off as a beloved tea mug gifted to me by beloved friends, and now it's a beloved tea mug gifted to me by not quite as beloved friends. And the fact that it's my tea mug at all, is temporary, right? As soon as it gets bumped by, any one of the 1,000 paper airplanes that flies through the kitchen every morning or whatever, and it falls on the ground and cracks, it could be my shards of mug, but I will probably just, put it out in the garden like we do with broken mugs, and it won't be my mug anymore. And no matter what happens, it relatively soon won't be my mug anymore, cosmically speaking. And so the mug doesn't have a self as a permanent mug identity, and it doesn't have an owner, which is myself. So the mind part of it is also empty. So anatta refers to the philosophical understanding that nothing has an eternal, unchanging identity. But in a more concrete way, it points to how everything is only contingently what we call it. And so that's not just this body where like, oh, I'm Sean, there's all the terms we use nowadays, right? I'm a cisgendered man from North America. I'm Californian. I'm mixed race. I'm queer. I'm 53 almost by a couple of days. I'm, like any number of things. And embedded in all of that is a whole pile of identities. I'm a Gen Xer. Totally empty, right? What does that even mean? We just came through New Year's and everyone's like, it's New Year's. Why was it New Year's? Well, it was New Year's because at some point the European world adopted a calendar based on a fictional date of Jesus's birth. So according to an ancient Christian calendar that we happen to still be using because the Christians won the war of who gets to be the calendar that the world uses, not all of the world, right? They got to be the calendar that America uses anyway. Woohoo, it's New Year's, right? But the moment of New Year's is anatta. It's empty, right? It was a conditioned designation. Nothing in the whirling of the planets thinks of January 1st as New Year's because there's no such thing as January, right? Why are there 12 months? Because people were afraid of the number 13, right? There should be 13 cycles of, there should be 13 moons and menstrual cycles in the year. And the moons match up to 13, but the Christians were like, ooh, 13. So there's 12 weirdly shaped months, Like everything about it is empty, based in conditions, based in culture. So, all of these identities, oh, I'm mixed race. What even does the mixed race mean? And you can deconstruct all of them. This is one of the beauties, actually, of contemporary deconstruction, which came out of 20th century Marxism and psychoanalysis and a couple of other important threads of culture. The postmodern is kind of what it's called, where you call into question all categories that modernism thought were solid. It's destabilizing. It's one of the reasons why reactionary governments and cultures dislike the postmodern. It is destabilizing. It destabilizes the family. It destabilizes identities. This whole thing where, the young ones have completely destabilized identity. So, half of any junior high in Berkeley, California is non-binary at this point. Like as a result of the postmodern, I think this is a beautiful understanding, actually, of conditioned identity coming forward, right? It was one thing that, that was like, oh, we're gonna deal with the fact that there's a few people who are trans and there's some people who are, gay and queer and bi, and we're gonna expand the alphabet to try to include everybody's flavor. And then the whole thing breaks down because microscopic identities, differentiate, proliferate endlessly, right? Every identity can be subdivided into micro identities within that. It's all not unreal and not unimportant, but conditioned and empty. Anatta is the recognition that categories that the mind wants to or has been trained to or conditioned to think of as reliable, solid determiners of truth, ways that we can orient to the world, that those things are born of conditions and therefore not ultimately reliable, and this is, and the reason really that I'm starting with the hot button cultural issues, gender, race, etc., is partly time, is partly because I want us to really grok that this is not an abstract philosophical topic, anatta, that it's actually, it points to something that regular folks all over the world like really wrestle with, like all the time. This is very real and ordinary, that identities are unstable, that psychology is unstable, that borders are unstable, right? So much arguing about borders. Borders are fiction. Someone at some point drew a line on a map, and then for a very long time there was a war over that line. The map that divides India from Pakistan, which is one of the most militarized borders in the world, was drawn with a ruler on a map by a British military man who had never been to the area, knew nothing about the cultures, didn't even look at where the rivers ran or anything. They just drew a line. If you look at much of the Middle East and you look at the borders of many of the countries there, that we were talking about this during the Iraq War, with the push for Kurdistan, because the Kurds don't have a country, because the British, when they drew the straight lines, didn't draw a country there. And so, empty. What does it mean to be, Iraqi or, Pakistani or Indian? When these identities fluctuate, they change century to century, decade to decade, sometimes, month to month. And so this recognition, the insight into anatta, the reflection on anatta is, it enters daily life, not necessarily through the subtle meditative recognition of the emptiness of my sense of self. You can do that. I'll talk about that for a bit. But also, I think it's one of the most powerful and interesting lenses we can bring to life in the world of culture, in our broader socio-political, ecological world. To actually read the news, be in conversations, take the kids to school, like whatever you do, be with your people, with the lens of instability, of categories, right? To understand that when, that when there's a conversation about, national identity, sexual identity, political identity, gender, race, of course, physical realities, communal identifying traits, that all of these are using categories that are useful in some situations and not useful in others. All of the categories are contingent. And so contingent is a way of saying, depends on something else, right? All of the categories are interdependent. That's anatta. Nothing stands alone. All right, so the philosophical basis of anatta is this idea that if there was an intrinsic nature or a fundamental essence to something, that essence would have to be eternal and unchanging, right? If there was such a thing as an ideal, Plato would call it an ideal form, the ideals or the ideas. If there was an ideal form of a thing, it would be the same always. So if there was a thing called person, that word and concept, and setting aside the difficulties of translation just into other human languages, but let's say even without that difficulty, even in English, let's say the word person, you think like, oh, I know what that word refers to, right? It refers to a human being with a body who has a kind of individual, you know, who has like individual rights to exist, you know? But, you know, there have been times in the not so distant past that word was, you know, at different times only applied or differently applied to white folks over brown folks, folks in male bodies over folks with female bodies. There's other cultures where terms like person are applied to any kind of animal that can be observed to have an individual expression. So the dog people, the chicken people, you know, the tree spirit people. The word only means what you think it means within a certain cultural frame. And without that cultural frame, first of all, the word is meaningless, but also it just means radically different things in different places in different times. This is what gets the reactionary, you know, wing of any culture very upset, because because deconstruction applies to everything. It applies not just to contentious categories like, you know, man, woman, which are very argued categories in, you know, many cultures in the world right now. But it also applies to concepts like, let's say, love or justice or truth, you know? Like, you know, to keep going with contentious cultural topics here, the word truth, right? You may think like, oh, I know what truth means. It's always meant, you know, that which, it's hard to say it without just giving a tautology, like, well, it's that which is true, you know? Well, what does that mean? Especially when you start to use the word as in, it's like, you know, well, I just know what's my truth, right? Or there are different, you know, well, there's different truths about a thing. And it's appropriate, if infuriating, to use the word this way, because there's no, you know, the agreement about what the word truth means and how it should be used is a cultural agreement. It's contingent, right? The word, there's not an absolute truth that is what it is outside of culture and agreement, right? And to the extent that there is anything that is absolute, that is to say eternal, permanent, one thing without ever changing, you know, logically, philosophically, there could only be one of those things, because if there was two of them, they'd have to be in relationship to each other, and therefore they would change each other through contact, therefore they wouldn't be eternal and unchanging. And so even concepts that we really rely on, you know, love, it's a, you know, how you think about love is probably a relatively modern way to think about love. In European culture, you know, famously individual romantic love, you know, it gets more or less, you might say, invented in about the 12th century in the tradition of the French chansons and the troubadours, who start to sing about chivalry and courtly love, and they invent the early great romances of, you know, Tristan and Isolde, and, you know, Arthur and Guinevere, and, you know, things like that. And before that, you don't really see love stories in the European mythos, right? Before the Odyssey, to stick with European mythos, before the Odyssey of Homer, you don't see individually named idiosyncratic human characters. You see archetypes and, you know, heroic archetypes, but you don't see individuals per se. Even the individuals in the, you know, early books of the Bible are, they have a kind of individuality, and some of them have a kind of personality that you can feel, but many of them, again, are you know, broad brush archetypes. There's an archetype of a hero, or of a or of a villain or a lover or and so even the cultural forms that shape our thinking, what it means to be an individual or what it means to love someone, you might feel like, well, but loving someone is not a concept. When you love someone, it's just a feeling. No one's telling you how to love someone. But if you, but it's not true, I would say, right? We've learned how to love someone. You've been taught. You've seen so many movies about romance. Those things teach you how to be, I feel like I can see my kid learning how to be, American, how to be Californian, how to be any number of things. They get a little message through, they get messages through everything, through their friend contact, through us, of course, as their parents, not hardly as much as I would wish, through media, through movies, and they begin to perform what they see, right? They start to quote movies and quote attitudes and quote, moods, as it were, and they share them amongst each other. And pretty soon you start to get personality traits, and things come forward. And, good stuff as well as not good stuff. Like, our job is not to teach children that everything is empty and nothing is real. They'll figure that out eventually, God willing, if they get, if they're well held in the Dharma. Our job actually, and this is maybe true for more than children, our job is not to try to tell people that everything they think is solid is not solid, but is to first teach wholesome identities, skillful, non-harming, helpful identities. And over time, those identities can build the kind of secure attachment, strong developmental process, and so solidness of being enough that they can practice in a way, feel secure and safe enough in the world to deconstruct, to see it clearly. So one of my landmates is doing a landscape project in the front yard, and as part of that, they went and bought a new Buddha statue for the front yard, and so it arrived, and so we were outside this afternoon, and there in the bushes was this new Buddha sitting there, and we were all like, oh, look at that, and my kid, bless his little Buddhist heart, he was like running around with his basketball and having all sorts of, having his outside time. And he saw the Buddha and he said, hey, where'd that come from? And he dropped the basketball and he ran over and crouched down and he gave the Buddha statue a full body hug. He just wrapped his arms around it and was like, ah. And so I'm thrilled, right? It's empty. It's empty. But what we've taught him is, and he's not always respectful, but often we've taught him that you're respectful and loving to these archetypes. He was talking earlier, I'm telling stories about how devotional my kid is. Don't get the wrong idea, right? He's got all sorts of qualities, but here's his devotional qualities. We were reading a kind of a scary book, and his mama said, like, maybe we shouldn't read the scary book right before bed, And he said, oh, it's okay, it's okay. Anytime I'm laying down in bed and I have any scary thoughts, I just think about Kuan Yin, and then the scary thoughts go away. He said, I just say Kuan Yin Pusa, Kuan Yin Pusa, which is one of the mantras for Kuan Yin. So you can say it if you want scary thoughts to go away. Kuan Yin Pusa. It works for my 8-year-old. And he said, and then the scary thoughts go away, and then I'm just thinking about Kuan Yin. So, Kuan Yin is empty, right? There's no self in Kuan Yin. There's no eternal nature to Kuan Yin, because the concept of Kuan Yin, right, is conditioned. It's conditioned by Chinese culture, by Chinese imagery, by Chinese language, by the Chinese translation of mythos from the Tibetan, from the Sanskrit, from the early Mahayana, from the dawn of the idea that there could be such a thing as a bodhisattva. Like there's so many influences there, right? Kuan Yin rides a water dragon. So, of course she does. And you can feel how there's, because all of those things are conditioned, they're empty, they still work. Like part of the mystery of anatta is that there's the recognition that everything is empty, contingent, unstable. But at the same time, there's the recognition that all of those categories are important. They allow us to function. It's important to me to be clear as I move through the world around how I bring forward my identities. It's important that I perform, my race, my sexuality, my gender, my social class, my responsibilities, that I perform these in a wholesome way. And so there's this way that the recognition and the practice of anatta is a kind of radical deconstruction, and you can do it in any moment, all the time. And the result of that is a kind of liberated mind. But very much at the same time, except when you're in deep meditation retreat or otherwise unhooked from your responsibilities, at the same time, our duty, I'll use that kind of traditional word, our duty in life is to perform our given social role, as empty as it may be, in a way that follows the precepts, that is helpful, not harmful, that actually serves the well-being of ourselves and others. And we do this because safety and well-being is necessary for insight. It's not you can't just rely on radical deconstruction and say, oh well, everything is radically empty, therefore nothing matters. That's wrong view. Anatta, part of what's beautiful about anatta is that it is one of the signposts. I'm not sure what the right simile is here, but for right view. Because anatta is actually right view, right? It's all of the characteristics are. It's right view to understand that even though things look permanent, feel permanent, that they are impermanent. It's right view to understand that even though the pleasurable seems appropriate to grasp at and the painful seems appropriate to push away, that those actions, those intentions are rooted in wrong view. Right? That to understand dukkha, to understand suffering, is part of right view. And to understand anatta is right view. Because it's wrong view, mistaken view, unskillful view, to get lost in the seeming solidity of any identity. Right? So the way this is often broken out is into the I, me, mine. This is my body, this is myself, this is my mug, this is my computer, this is my sitting group. Like whatever kind of ownership I bring to it, anatta tells me to remember that ownership is temporary, contingent, and ultimately illusory. And that the more I cling to that identity, the more I'll suffer. Right? So, anatta is a partner to anicca and dukkha in the sense that when there's clinging is something like the fantasy that something would be more permanent than it is. I'm going to hold on to the pleasure. I'm going to resist the unpleasant. I'm going to live longer. I'm not going to get sick. My beloved is not going to die. I'm not going to lose my favorite tea mug. I'm queer and I was born that way. Like all of the identities that I think like, these are super solid. I would never marry a Republican, like whatever your thing is. To recognize that all of those are contingent and fluctuating is also a way to learn to not grasp at them, right? Because there's nothing there to grasp at. It comes out as the same recognition as impermanence, right? They're really siblings. There's nothing there to grasp at anyway. The thing that I so think I am, there's nothing there. But, and I keep wanting to come back to this just to finish the expression here, you always have to swing back to the relative. That's true. Deconstruction is true. And it's appropriate to perform our roles well. So it comes back to ethics. It comes back to skill in relationships and action and engagement. And it's important always to say and to remember that calling upon deconstruction in order to avoid uncomfortable truths about anything in the ordinary world is a kind of spiritual bypass. So to call on Anatta to propose that because borders are fictions, I'm just going to ignore all the politics around borders and the wars about land and nationhood. That's a kind of spiritual bypass, To understand that race and gender are fictions ultimately, or they're not really fictions, they're as real as anything else, but that they're contingent and conditioned. It's appropriate for my own freedom for me to live with that as the knowing in my heart, but it's inappropriate to brandish that idea around in a social or political conversation in a way that's going to propose that something that someone else is really relying on for a sense of stability in the world is actually not there. You don't insult people with anatta, to be like, oh yeah, you're so fixated on gender, you poor deluded fool, right? Like, no, you don't do that. It's important in the world that we care for everyone in a way that supports the heart to be at ease. So I'll let it rest there, and we'll open into some time for conversation. The conversation always oscillates between these two things, right? There's the insight that conforms with emptiness, and then there's the action which conforms with the relative, which conforms with conditions. And enlightened action is always about, like, how do you bring the recognition of this kind of radical openness? How do you bring that into the ordinary complex situations that you find all the time? Like, sure, everything is radically empty, and my kid is having a hard time fitting in socially with the dude club in second grade. And so, like, sure, gender is empty and everything's empty, and there's these dudes, they're kind of mean and exclusionary, and my kid has a boy body and he's just trying to figure out where to fit in, right? Like, it's just real, and the answer to how to be in the world, how to respond to the world, doesn't come from the radical emptiness of anatta. The answer comes from engagement with what is, with intimacy and curiosity, and actually being in the political, social, interdependent, ecological mess. There's no escape from the relative. The thing that the recognition of anatta gives is equanimity. It lets you actually participate without getting lost in the categories, you know. So like for me, it's very helpful for me to not essentialize masculinity with these, like, in this particular situation I'm talking about, right? There's a bunch of boys, they're acting like immature young men sometimes do in second grade, and they're causing some suffering. If I solidify the category of like boy, it's actually much harder to reckon with this situation. At the same time, if I completely dismiss the category, I'm going to miss important information that's here. And so, you know, anatta is a balm for my own heart to understand the conditioned nature of these concepts that are so, you know, moving energy around the world. The insight allows me not to be as caught in it, and then that gives me more of like my feet on the ground and you know, really a solid, more of a chance to engage with what's happening without my own confusion coming into it, you know. So everything is empty, but also real and matters, and identities matter and have to be taken care of. So there's a paradox, and that's where the music, you know, comes out in our practice. So we'll pause there with that for tonight. Well, thanks for listening.